She swore she'd never touch a human, until one reached for her through fire. The air in the human embassy was an offense. It was a sterile, recycled breeze that failed to mask the smell beneath. A cloying, musky odor of base-level human pheromones, thick with the scent of their secreted oils and their manufactured foods. It clung to the fine, iridescent fibers of her diplomatic silks, coated the back of her throat, and made Sorina, cultural attaché of the Xylos Imperium, want to scour her skin raw. She kept her posture perfect, a line of aristocratic grace, the smile she offered the passing human dignitaries a sharp, beautiful weapon. Her hand, hidden in the sweeping folds of her gown, rested on the Hiss-4 vibroblade strapped to her thigh. The weapon was a comfort, a small piece of lethal Xylos-forged reality in this padded, synthetic human room. Her gaze slid for the 20th time in as many minutes to the human, Gideon. He stood 5 paces to her left, a half-step behind, as protocol dictated. He was a monument to his species' crude, forceful design. A broad, dense wall of muscle poured into a formal black suit that looked both expensive and, on him, utterly pointless. He was, to her eyes, an animal taught to stand on its hind legs. The stillness was what she found most offensive. For the last hour of this diplomatic reception, he had stood with an economy of motion that she, in her cultural arrogance, mistook for a lack of intellect. His hands, thick-fingered and scarred at the knuckles, were clasped loosely in front of him. His face was a blank, neutral mask, the jaw strong, the mouth a firm, unsmiling line. His eyes, a dull, flat gray, methodically scanned the reception hall, cataloging every exit, every cluster of guests, every servitor drone. He saw everything, she was sure, and understood nothing. He was her bodyguard. The Alliance government, in its infinite, baffling wisdom, had insisted on assigning her a full-time diplomatic security corps agent, a human agent. She, Sorina, a high blood of the Imperium, augmented and trained, was being protected by a primitive. His presence was a calculated statement of disrespect from the human delegation, and his musky personal scent, a mixture of soap, sweat, and that unmistakable humanness, was a constant low-level assault. A muted chime, soft and melodic, signaled the end of the reception. Gideon's head turned, a fractional, precise movement. "To the transport plaza, attaché," he said. His voice was a low, deep resonance that vibrated in her chest. It was a physical intrusion, and she resented it with a cold fire. "I am aware of the schedule, officer," she replied, her tone silken and chilled. They moved. Sorina glided, her Xylos grace making her seem to float above the plush carpet. Gideon walked, his tread heavy, planted, each step an assertion of his mass. He was a creature of gravity, and he imposed it on the world around him. The sterile, perfumed air of the embassy gave way to the cavernous, open-air plaza of the central station. It was vast, a neutral space built with soaring arches and holographic nebulas swirling on the domed ceiling, all designed to inspire awe. Sorina just saw a kill box. Everywhere, station security, clad in bulky blue and gray armor, stood conspicuously, their rifles held in low ready. They were loud, obvious, and to her trained eye, deeply incompetent. "Your human security is enthusiastic," she murmured, the compliment a perfectly sharpened insult. She glanced at Gideon. His gaze was not on the local security. It was sweeping the high gantries, the shadowed transport hubs, the dense clusters of civilians moving toward the transit tubes. "One wonders if they are here to stop a threat or to be one," she added, goading him. He didn't look at her. His eyes paused on a maintenance crew high above, their plasma welders spitting sparks. "Yes, attaché," he replied. The flat, non-committal agreement was more infuriating than any argument. He hadn't even registered the insult. Or worse, he had not cared. The animal was not trained to parse sarcasm. They were halfway across the plaza, moving toward the shielded diplomatic shuttle. The open space made her skin crawl. She felt the sights of 1,000 unseen rifles on her back. The air was split by a high-frequency shriek. It was not a sound, but a feeling, a spike of focused energy that pierced her sensitive hearing and made the bones in her skull vibrate. A bolt of superheated plasma, bright white and crackling, struck the station guard beside Gideon. The man didn't scream. He didn't have time. He simply ceased to exist, vaporized in a flash of blinding blue-white light and a wet, percussive thump that scattered his ablative armor like shrapnel. The plaza erupted, Civilians screamed, a single, high-pitched wave of animal panic. They scattered, a tide of flesh running in every direction. Alarm klaxons blared, a useless, panicked wail. Sorina's hand went to her vibroblade, her Xylos enhancements flooding her system with combat stimuli. Her vision sharpened, time slowed, she was fast. He was faster. The blank, simple man was gone. The stillness, the neutrality, the docility, it all vanished in the space of a single violent heartbeat. The transition was so sudden, so absolute, it stole her breath. Gideon didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the vaporized guard. He was already in motion. His left hand, the one that had been clasped so passively, shot out. His grip closed around her upper arm. It was not a polite touch. It was not a request. It was an iron band of pure, impersonal possession. It was a brand. "Down," he roared. His voice was not the rumbling baritone from the embassy. This was a raw, guttural command that ripped from his throat, a sound of pure, concentrated violence. He didn't pull her. He drove her. He used his own 300-pound mass as a battering ram, his shoulder colliding with her ribs, his arm an unbreakable cage. He shoved her with brutal, unthinking force, his only concern to move her from here to there. They crashed behind a large concrete planter as a second and third plasma bolt slagged the ground where they had been standing, sending up plumes of molten stone. She landed hard, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. She snarled, a low Xylos hiss of fury, infuriated by the rough handling, the indignity of it. She looked up, her lips pulled back from her teeth, ready to gut him for daring to lay his human hands on her. She froze. Gideon was already crouched, his body a solid shield between her and the Plaza. His suit jacket was torn, revealing the dark, ballistic weave armor beneath. His sidearm, a heavy-caliber projectile weapon that looked impossibly large, was in his hand, as if it had simply willed itself there. His blank, gray eyes were gone. In their place was a cold Arctic focus. He was a different man, a killer. Attackers were descending from the gantries, 3 of them, clad in matte black, sensor-dampening armor. They were ignoring the scattering, panicked security forces. They were moving with a fluid, predatory grace that she knew. It was a grace she had trained her entire life to perfect. They were moving like Xylos. One of them, sighting on their position, turned. His faceplate was a polarized black void. But as he moved, the chaotic emergency lighting caught the side of his neck, below the helmet's seal. Sorina saw the subdermal markings, the crimson and gold etchings of the Kavath, the Imperial Cleaner Corps. Her blood went cold. Her heart, which had been hammering with adrenaline, seemed to stop. These were not random terrorists. They were not human insurgents. This was not chaos. This was a purge. The man raised his plasma rifle, aiming not at the human security, not at the crowds, but directly at her. It was an execution. The Xylos cleaner's rifle glowed, charging for the kill shot. Gideon gave him no time. He didn't aim for the man's head or chest, protected by the heavy armor. He aimed for the weapon itself. The heavy crack of his projectile weapon, so primitive, so loud, echoed in the plaza. The slug, a dense core penetrator, struck the Xylos' plasma rifle just below the energy coil. The weapon exploded, a violent blue-white flare that tore the cleaner's arm off at the shoulder and sent him screaming. It was the most precise, brutal, and insulting shot Sorina had ever seen. Gideon was already moving, hauling her up by the arm, his iron grip bruising her. The diplomat was gone. This was a soldier, a warrior, and she was his package. "This way now," he commanded. He didn't run toward the exits. He ran away from them, back toward the embassy, but veered sharply, shoving her toward a simple, unmarked maintenance hatch she hadn't even registered. He kicked the lock, and the reinforced metal door blasted open from his foot. He shoved her into the darkness, not waiting for her compliance, and tumbled in after her, firing 2 more shots back into the plaza to cover their retreat. The heavy steel door slammed shut, plunging them into a sudden, echoing silence. They were in a subterranean maintenance corridor. The air was cold, damp, and thick with the smell of rusted metal and ozone. The only light came from thin red emergency strips running along the floor. Sorina stumbled, her diplomatic silks catching on a rusted pipe. She was pressed against his back, his heat radiating through the thin fabric of his shirt. The corridor was tight, no more than 4 feet wide. She could feel every shift of his muscles as he reloaded his weapon by feel, the click-clack of the magazine seeding an intimate, metallic sound in the dark. She was suffocating. The man's scent, no longer masked by embassy perfume, was overwhelming. It was cordite, sweat, and that raw, coppery human smell. But it was no longer just repulsive. It was powerful. It was the smell of the thing that had just saved her life. It was confusing. She felt a strange, unwelcome tremor in her stomach. She fought for her composure, leaning back against the damp concrete wall. The ice of the betrayal was setting in, colder and sharper than the fear. "They're Xylos," she stated. Her voice was flat, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Gideon didn't turn. He was scanning the darkness ahead, his head canted, listening. "I saw," he grunted. His voice was a low, calm vibration. The simplicity of his acceptance was maddening. She wanted him to be shocked, to be terrified, to ask why. She wanted him to react as a primitive should. "They are my people," she snarled, the words a low hiss. "The cleaner corps. They were sent for me." "I know," he said. He said it with no judgment, no surprise. It was just a fact, a mission parameter. He had processed her betrayal before she had. "They want you dead," he continued, his voice still that impossible, infuriating calm, "which means this tunnel is compromised." He grabbed her arm again, but the grip was different. It wasn't the panic shove in the plaza. It was a firm, grounding pressure. "We have to move. They'll know we took this route." He began to pull her forward, deeper into the station's unlit guts, but he never got to take the first step. A deafening, tearing groan came from above them. It was not the shriek of a plasma bolt. It was a sound of catastrophic failure, of metal supports designed to hold a city in the sky being ripped apart like paper. Gideon's reaction was pure instinct. He didn't look up, he didn't hesitate. He shouted a single guttural word, a human curse, raw and meaningless. He shoved her. It was the same move from the plaza, but 1,000 times more desperate. He didn't just push her, he threw her against the corridor wall, twisting as he did, his own massive body following to cover hers, to become a shield of flesh and armor. The world ended. A secondary structural charge, one planted directly above the maintenance corridor, detonated. The explosion was not a crack. It was a deep, definitive, foundational boom that liquefied the concrete ceiling. The tunnel didn't just collapse. It was obliterated. Tons of plasteel, concrete, and rebar, the very bones of the station, pancaked down into the narrow space. Sorina felt a moment of impossible, crushing weight, a single, sharp spike of agony. She heard the snap of Gideon's armor, the sharp, choked gasp he made as the primary impact took him in the back. Then there was only darkness, total, absolute, and suffocating. The air was a thick, unbreathable fog of pulverized concrete and dust. The silence that followed the roar was even more terrifying. There was only the high-pitched, faint tinnitus of the explosion in her ears, and the slow, agonizing groan of stressed metal settling around them, a tomb tightening its grip. She tried to move. She couldn't. She tried to draw a breath. She couldn't. Panic, cold and alien to her Xylos discipline, seized her throat. Her left side was numb, her entire body held in a vice. A massive, plasteel support beam, impossibly heavy, was across her chest and hips, pinning her to the floor. The weight was crushing the air from her lungs, millimeter by millimeter. She was trapped, she was helpless, and she was going to die in a dark, forgotten hole, buried with a human she despised. From somewhere in the darkness, just feet away, she heard a low, pained groan. He was still alive. Darkness, dust, the taste of pulverized stone on her tongue. Sorina's Xylos-enhanced lungs, capable of holding a breath for 10 minutes, were failing her. The weight on her chest was absolute, a mountain pressing her into the grit. She was breathing in short, agonizing sips, each one a desperate, failing fight. Helpless, the word was a poison. A Xylos agent was never helpless. And yet, a muffled, wet cough came from the blackness, a scrape of armor on concrete. "Attaché?" Gideon's voice. It was not the calm baritone from the tunnel or the sharp, guttural roar from the plaza. This was a strained, ragged sound, thick with pain. A metallic click. A single, brilliant white beam of light sliced through the choking dust. It was blinding, a star of impossible brightness in their tomb. The beam wavered, shaking, then moved, sweeping across the jagged cavern of their collapse. It landed on her. He was 10 feet away, wedged in a V-shaped pocket of debris. He was bleeding. A dark, wet gash ran from his temple into his hairline, and his suit jacket was shredded, the tactical armor beneath cracked and splintered along his back. He had taken the brunt of the ceiling. He pushed a piece of rebar off his legs and began to crawl. It was not a man moving, it was an animal. He was wounded, his left leg dragging, but he moved with a slow, agonizing, unstoppable purpose. He crawled over the shifting rubble, his light fixed on her, an unblinking eye. He reached the edge of the massive plasteel beam that held her prisoner, and he had to get close. He slipped into the narrow space beside her, his body pressing against her trapped left side. His face was inches from hers. She could feel the heat radiating from him, see the grit stuck to the sweat and blood on his skin. She could count the dark stubble on his jaw. The sheer, suffocating proximity of him was an invasion. He was touching her. His thigh was pressed against her shoulder. His hip was jammed against her arm. His breath, hot and tasting of dust, ghosted across her cheek. She had despised his smell, his presence, his very species. Now he was the only other living thing in the universe. His gloved hands, large and dark, began to move, running over the beam with a practiced, impersonal assessment. His fingers probed the edge where the metal met her ribs, checking the pressure. "Respirator compromised," he rasped, his voice low. She tried to answer, and all that came out was a choked gasp. "I can't breathe." She hated the sound. It was the voice of a victim. "Lungs compressed," he muttered to himself. He shone the light on her. "You're pinned at the hip and the left pectoral ridge. I have to see the trap." Before she could protest, he produced a combat knife from a sheath on his vest. The blade was black, non-reflective. He didn't ask permission. He hooked the blade into the ruined, priceless fibers of her diplomatic silks just above her waist. The sound of the fabric ripping was obscenely loud in the silence. It was a sharp, tearing zip, a violation. He cut the gown from her hip to her shoulder, peeling the wet, dust-caked fabric away. His light followed the blade. The beam was crushing her, the metal edge digging deep. Her skin, a pale jade green, was already darkening with a massive contusion. His hand, bare now, the glove ripped away, brushed her skin as he felt for the exact pressure point. His fingers were calloused, warm, and shockingly human against her flesh. Sorina shuddered, a violent, full-body tremor she could not control. It was not from the cold, it was not from disgust. It was a reaction so alien, so unwelcome, she had no name for it. "Stay with me," he ordered, mistaking the tremor for shock. He grabbed a thick piece of rebar, wedging the end into a crack in the floor. "I'm going to try and lever it. Just an inch. Get ready." He put his back into it, his shoulder shoving against the metal rod. He grunted, a low, pained sound, his muscles straining against the impossible physics. The man who had kicked down a steel door was now fighting a mountain. The beam didn't move, not a millimeter. He collapsed, panting, his forehead resting on the cold beam. "No," he breathed, "it's seated, too heavy." A new sound, from somewhere down the tunnel they had been escaping from. A high-pitched metallic grind, the whine of a plasma cutter. They weren't just trapped, they were being hunted. "They're coming," Sorina whispered, the last of her rage turning to a cold, hard dread. Gideon's head snapped up. His eyes, no longer flat gray but a burning, focused silver in the beam of his light, scanned their prison. He was looking for another way, another lever. His gaze fell to the space under the beam, a narrow, jagged gap near her waist where the floor had buckled. "I need to see the anchor point," he said. He shoved his hand into the dark, gravel-filled gap, his fingers probing. He was feeling for a place to get leverage from underneath. His hand, deep in the darkness, brushed against her hip. "It's just rubble, she started to say. "No," he cut in. His voice was different. It was dangerously low. His fingers had found something that wasn't rock or rebar, something smooth, metallic, and wired. With a grunt, he ripped it free. Wires tore, and he pulled his hand back, his light immediately fixing on the object in his palm. It was small, black, and Xylos made, a proximity-fused plasma detonator. It hadn't been under the beam. It had been attached to it, set to go off when the beam fell. But the force of the collapse had jammed it, the wiring torn, preventing its detonation. Gideon's bloody, grim face turned to her. His eyes were arctic. "This wasn't a diversion," he said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "The explosion above was to drive us down here. This beam, this was the real trap." He held the detonator up in the beam of his light, its Xylos markings unmistakable. "They didn't want you caught in the blast. They wanted you crushed. They wanted you to die slow." He paused, his gaze boring into hers. "They wanted to make sure." The words hung in the dusty, superheated air. They wanted to make sure. The betrayal was no longer an abstract. It was this: a cold, meticulous plan, an ambush to drive her underground, a secondary charge to trap her, and a final personal detonator to ensure that she died, slowly, helplessly, crushed in a tomb of their making. All her life she had served the Imperium. All her honor, her blood, her faith, all of it had been for nothing. They hadn't just sentenced her to death. They had left her to die with an animal, the ultimate Xylos insult. The rage that had sustained her, a bright, cold fire, simply extinguished. It left behind a bleak, empty cold. The high-pitched whine of the plasma cutter was closer now, just yards away. It stopped, replaced by the grating, metallic shove of debris being cleared. Xylos' voices, sharp and clear, cut through the darkness. "She's in here. The locator signal is dead. Find the body." They weren't coming to rescue her. They were coming to confirm the kill. Sorina let her head fall back against the rubble. A single sharp laugh, a sound like breaking glass, escaping her lips. "Your duty is fulfilled, human," she said, her voice flat and empty. The pressure in her chest was immense, each word a spike of pain. "They are not here for you. You can still make it back. That is an order, officer." Gideon didn't move. He was staring at her, his light fixed on her face. The look in his eyes was something she had never seen before. It wasn't pity. It wasn't fear. It was a raw, primal, and terrifying focus. He looked at her, then at the beam, then back at her. The animal was thinking. "No," he said, his voice a low growl. "That is a direct order," she hissed, a flash of her old command returning. "Your life is not forfeit. Mine is. Flee." "They're not getting you," he panted. He turned from her, back to the beam. He tossed the useless detonator aside. He grabbed the thick rebar, the one that had failed him before. "This is pointless," she choked. "It won't move." "It'll move," he grunted, wedging the bar deep into the crack, angling it differently. He didn't just put his shoulder against it. This time he shoved his entire body into the narrow space, jamming the end of the rebar against his collarbone, using his back and legs as the fulcrum. He was trying to become the lever. He took a single deep breath. "Ah!" A roar ripped from his throat. It was not a human sound. It was a primal, agonizing scream of pure, unadulterated effort. It was the sound of a creature pushing itself past every limit of sinew and bone. The muscles in his neck and arms bulged, the veins standing out like thick cords. The gash on his temple reopened, and blood streamed down his face, mixing with the sweat and grime. He was a terrifying, magnificent human thing, a picture of brutal, focused agony. And it was all for her. The massive plasteel beam groaned. It shifted, a millimeter, two. A shower of dust and gravel rained down from above. Sorina felt the pressure on her chest ease, just a fraction. She gasped, a real, desperate intake of air. Then, with a piercing shriek of metal on metal, the rebar, the solid, 2-inch thick steel rod, bent. It folded, twisting into a useless U-shape under the impossible, agonizing load. The beam slammed back down, settling with a heavy final thud, heavier than before. Gideon collapsed, his body slumping against the wreckage, the bent rebar clattering from his grasp. He was shaking, gasping for air, his strength utterly spent. "It's done," Sorina whispered, the last spark of hope dying. "Go now! Let me die!" The plasma cutter roared to life again, this time on the other side of the debris wall, just feet away. They were breaking through. "Flee, you fool," she screamed, all pretense of command gone, her voice raw panic. Gideon looked at the wall, then at her. His eyes found the small, jagged gap in the rubble near her trapped hand. The hole was a foot wide, full of sharp-edged, broken concrete and twisted steel. He didn't say a word. With a grimace of pain, he began to rip at the cracked, useless armor on his left arm. He tore the splintered plasteel plates from his shoulder and forearm, tossing them aside. "What are you doing?" she whispered, a new terrible dread dawning. "Gideon, stop! That's no!" He ignored her. He was on his hands and knees, his arm bare from the shoulder down, the muscles thick, the skin pale and slick with blood from a dozen smaller cuts. "They're not," he panted, his voice raw, "getting you." He turned, repositioned his body, and shoved his unprotected, living arm into the grinding, jagged hole. He screamed. It was not the roar of effort from before. It was a sharp, choked, agonizing sound as serrated steel tore into his bicep and a spike of concrete gouged his flesh. He hit a blockage, a tangle of rebar. "Gideon, no, stop!" she shrieked. He roared again, a guttural cry of pure defiance, and shoved. He put all his weight, all his remaining strength into that single sacrificial act. He drove his arm deeper into the unseen, crushing black maw of the wreckage. There was a wet, sickening final snap that was louder than his scream. It was the sound of his ulna breaking. He drove his arm past the blockage, past the rebar that had bent, past the jagged steel that had torn his flesh. On her side of the beam, in the tiny gap near her trapped hand, his fingers appeared. They were not the strong, capable, calloused hands that had assessed her injuries. This was a mangled, bloody ruin. His hand was slick with a dark, viscous crimson, his fingers twisted at an unnatural angle. He was shaking violently, his entire body convulsing from the shock and the agony. But the hand was open, reaching. He had broken his arm, torn his flesh to ribbons, and shoved the shattered bones through a gap of jagged steel for this. For her, the whine of the plasma cutter on the other side of the wall reached a deafening crescendo. A large section of the concrete began to glow cherry red. They were seconds away. Sorina stared at his hand. This human hand, the symbol of the chaotic, primitive, lesser species she had been trained to despise, the hand of the animal she had been left to die with. It was raw, it was powerful, it was broken, and it was the most magnificent, terrifying, and defiant thing she had ever seen. Her hatred, her training, her entire world fractured and fell away, leaving only the dark, the dust, and this single impossible sacrificial act. The plasma cutter punched through the wall. She reached. Her elegant, long, green fingers, shaking, slid against his bloody palm. She laced her fingers with his. The contact was an explosion. It was not just touch. It was a raw, agonizing transfer of everything. She felt the grinding of his shattered bones, the tremor of his agony, the desperate, unyielding strength of his intent. His grip, even with a broken, ruined hand, was iron. It was a vice. It was a promise. "Got you," he gasped, his voice a wet, choking sound. His body slumped, his consciousness fading, but his grip tightened. With his other hand, his right hand, he fumbled at his vest, pulling a small, flat transponder free. He clicked the activation stud. "Who?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My people," he breathed, his head resting against the cold debris. "They're faster." The Xylos team burst through the smoking hole they had cut in the wall. 3 of them, black-armored, their rifles raised, the blue light of the plasma coils reflecting in their dark visors. "There!" the lead one shouted, leveling his weapon. "Kill them both! Finish it!" Simultaneously, so perfectly timed it was a thing of violent beauty, the ceiling above Gideon and the Xylos team vaporized. It was not a collapse. It was a controlled, tactical breach. A perfect, molten-edged circle appeared in the plasteel, and through the smoke and sudden, blinding white light, 2 figures in black, non-reflective human armor rappelled down. They didn't wait to land. They were firing before their boots hit the rubble. The firefight was 3-dimensional, brutal, and over in less than 2 seconds. The Xylos team, focused on their trapped, helpless targets below, never even saw the threat from above. They were cut down in a hail of precision, high-velocity rounds. One of the commandos was at Gideon's side, his weapon still smoking. He attached a rescue harness to Gideon's vest, his movements economical and terrifyingly fast. "Sir, your arm is... Christ, it's severed, we have to apply." "No," Gideon roared. He was fading, his eyes rolling, but his voice was a pure guttural command. He yanked on her hand, his grip unbreakable. "Take, both." The commando didn't hesitate. He looked at Sorina, pinned and helpless, then at his commander's mangled arm, still threaded through the wreckage to hold her. He understood. He looped the harness under her free shoulder. "Lifting now," he bellowed. They were lifted together. The rescue line went taut, pulling them up out of the smoke and the ruin. The sudden violent motion, combined with the release of the crushing pressure, was an agony Sorina had never known. The world dissolved into a gray, spinning vortex. But as she was ripped free from her tomb, as the G-force and the pain and the sheer impossible relief stole her consciousness, she did not look at the rescuers. Her eyes were locked on his. His face was a mask of blood and grime, his body limp in the harness. But his gray eyes were open, and they were locked on her. He was still holding her hand. She saw him pass out from the pain, his head slumping forward. But his grip, his impossible, defiant, human grip, did not lessen. It was a shackle, it was a vow. And as the darkness finally took her, Sorina knew that everything she had ever believed was a lie, and the only truth in the universe was the shattered, bloody human hand that had refused to let her go.